when I put this presentation together, I wasn't sure exactly what a workshop should be for this meeting. So I had a presentation ready that I've adapted to this, and it usually takes about 45 minutes, but considering the audience and stuff, I think we can move that up and move it more quickly. So it's about long-term studies in Port Valdez, Alaska, and as you can see in the background, what makes Port Valdez unique is that it's a site with the marine oil terminal that serves as the terminus of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So you can see in the background we have the marine terminal viewed from the bay, and over on the right-hand side we have a tanker docked at one of the facilities. And so this is a major oil terminal in the middle of Alaska. And so it's declining volumes now, but at its peak it was producing something like shipping a million gallons a day. It's a tremendous amount of volume of oil. And it's changed now. This study has been funded by Alaska Pipeline Service Company. We do environmental monitoring for them. But at the outset, in the initial studies there in Port Valdez were also partially funded by NSF, National Science Foundation studies or funding. So one of the things that makes this important to Alaska is Alaska coastal aesthetics. Alaska coastal waters are of interest to wide-ranging stakeholders due to their beauty. So you can see this shot of a glacier at the end of Port Valdez. We care deeply about the resources we depend on. There's a fishing vessel in the same area, highlighting the interaction between fisheries and commercial and industrial interests. And we also care about our resources for personal use. This is my son and I were fishing dip netting for salmon on the Copper River, and we have a number of opportunities for Alaskans to utilize the marine resources, and some of us depend very heavily on those resources, some to a greater extent than others. So this is pretty important to Alaskans to help manage these resources, and resources include numerous marine mammals and birds, some of them endangered, some of them doing quite well. So I've been involved in I am involved in three environmental monitoring projects. The first one is Alaska Monitoring and Assessment. If many of you might be familiar with the USA EPA's EMAP program. The AK map, the Alaska map, is an extension of that into an Alaska setting. Given that we have the coastline of Alaska is like 4 times greater than the total coastline of the U.S., we can't do that all in 1 year like the rest of the programs do. So these different shadings are different portions that are done in different years. So we have South Alaska, we have South Central, we have the Aleutian Islands, we have the Bering Sea area, then we have the Arctic. We've been working on the Arctic now for about 3 years. We're going to go. This crew is going back out again this year. So it's the 4th year of trying to accomplish one set of samples for the area, and the area in red has not been done yet. So we're working our way through the Alaska coastline. The idea is to assess status and trends for a number of different components in the marine environment. I've been involved with the Chukchi Sea Environmental Studies Program since 2008. I presented this slide earlier. Kind of just shows the study area. Here's a more expanded view. The oceanographic stations, each of the groups have done a slightly different sampling program. This gives you a general idea of the region we've been looking at there from 2008 to 2014. A program I want to talk about in this presentation is Port Valdez Environmental Studies Program. It's a long-term environmental monitoring project, monitoring sediments adjacent to an outfall for treated ballast waters. So single-hold tankers would come in from ports in California, and they would have to fill their holds with ballast water so that they would be taken onto shore. Here at the facility, there was a ballast water treatment plant, so it's just like a sewage treatment plant, had 3 phases, chemical separation, biological state separation, and then it had an air stripper treatment process. And so they had these 3 different components, and now by law, the single-hold tankers after the Exxon Valdez oil spill are not allowed to come in anymore. They phased them out, and now they're doing double-hold tankers where the ballast water is not put into the oil holds. And so the volume of water, of treated ballast water, has declined over time, and which has positive results in our environment. So this is a picture of Alaska. This is the Gulf, or the Gulf of Alaska here. This is Prince William Sound. We are up in a corner in Prince William Sound. Prince William Sound itself is a large glacial fjord. As you can see from this photo, that there's a lot of ice sheets still in the mountains. So Port Valdez is a glacial fjord. And one of the distinctions is, I'm sorry, this plot doesn't show up very well, but this portion here is a cloud of glacial sediments in the water in the summertime. So you have the water coming in, it kind of spins over this way and comes out this way, and that's one of the things we'll be talking about. But so the unique features of the fjords are have glaciers and glacial sediments. We have steep sides, and we have sharp environmental gradients. What one might expect to see over the course of 100 miles or more in coastal settings, we see over the course of 20 kilometers or 20 miles here, 20 nautical miles in Port Valdez. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And also, glacial fjords are sites of human activities and change. Across the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere too, fjords actually provide deep water access to shorelines, so they're sites for shipping. They're just human activity. The steep environmental changes are great places for fisheries at times. So, and there's also tends to be a lot of resources in the mountains surrounding that. So we can look at a general pattern of fjord ecology, and we've done enough work in Port Valdez that we can at least fill in some of the blanks, so we haven't done a food web study itself. The point of this is that in this fjord, most of the energy flows through the pelagic system, or in an intertidal system. Not a lot of, as much of it does not flow down to the deep benthos. There's not a lot of energy stored down in the sediments. So some of the facts about Port Valdez: it was heavily impacted by sediment slumping and tsunami scouring after a 9.2 magnitude earthquake in Prince William Sound in 1964, the Great Alaska Earthquake. It's a site of a major marine oil terminal, and it's a site, of a shoreline fish hatchery. And I'll come back to that, but the shoreline, the terminal's in one place, and just down the shoreline is the fish hatchery. So it's amazing that we have these two industries closely spaced, and they're compatible. They're surviving and functioning both quite well. So I was pleased with Dr. Schubert's presentation earlier, because it plays into some of the concepts of our intertidal work. We have done intertidal work in the Port Valdez, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that as an example of some of what we see. And so in our intertidal gradients, we have two closely associated gradients of the deposition of glacial flour and glacial sediments in the water column, and then that deposition on shore, and salinity. Glacial meltwater, of course, has high sediment loads and slow salinity, so we see that at the head of the fjord. Over at the mouth of the fjord, we see, low salinity, high glacial sediments at the head of the fjord, high salinity and low glacial sediments at the mouth of the fjord. So we have this joint influence of both low salinity and high sediments in the fjord. So here's our area of low salinity and high glacial sediments, and over there would be low salinity and higher salinity, and low glacial sediments. So at the head of the fjord, we have brackish water and grasses. Then we have mudflats, and we might have some rock pinnacles that haven't been covered up yet. In mid-fjord, we can get cobble beaches. And then at the end of the fjord, mouth of the fjord, we can get rocky shores. This is a visualization of part of what we see extended down into the deep basin. Clearly, we have this exact pattern that Dr. Schubert was talking about. At the one end, we have lots of terrestrial plants grading out into the marine community, and in both the plant and the biological communities follow 10 larger ones. The ones we can see follow that pattern. There's a good raises lots of questions about the smaller stuff we don't observe and how those patterns fit. And but we do see that transition from terrestrial over to rocky shores. And interestingly enough, that salinity gradient interacts with some of the species, the invertebrate predators, to cause to change competitive balances. And so the biological interactions that result from indirect effects from the salinity and sediment deposition rates actually play a major role in our community in the intertidal. But I wanted to talk about subtidal studies, right? So we get paid to play in the dirt. I'm 55 years old almost, and I still get paid to play in the dirt. What a life, huh? So we've been working there since 1971. I haven't been there since then, but my mentor Howard Fader was, and we in 2012 the biological sampling was eliminated from the monitoring program, but we have an extensive database. Our target animals are sediment-dwelling invertebrates, and there's our main piece of gear, the Van Veen grab. And we take a grab of samples, we drop them in a sieve bucket, we sieve them through a 1 millimeter mesh screen. Animals are sorted, identified, and counted and weighed. And there's a shot of us washing things down. Alaska is known for its weather, but we get out there and we have some pretty nice days. One thing I was going to comment on, if anybody here is familiar with invertebrate studies elsewhere, a lot of times people use 0.5 millimeter screens instead, but because of the glacial sediments, we can't do that. That's just too difficult. It's hard to even wash some of these through a 1 millimeter mesh screen. So here's some of the animals we're talking about. We have echinoderms, bivalves, some crustaceans, and polychaetes. Glacial sediments eliminate a lot of the crustaceans, amphipods, and whatnot that we might expect to see. So the system is dominated by bivalves and polychaetes, such as these guys. And interestingly enough, we have a burrowing anemone that shows up. So why monitor invertebrates? The sediment-dwelling invertebrates are great because they can't escape the environmental conditions. They either adapt, move, or die. So we have that transition from high disturbance areas with low diversity to no disturbance and higher diversity. So I wanted to piece out some sources of variability in Port Valdez and what we've learned about. And the first thing is a natural sediment gradient. We saw that kind of joint influence of salinity and sediment in the intertidal. That also plays out in the subtidal. And what I want to look at is we have this set of stations that we sampled throughout time in various years. But this set of stations, a number of these were sampled consecutively, not continuously, but consecutively since 1971 to 2002, or 2012, excuse me. So here's my picture. You can kind of see that sediment flower, the glacial flower in the water column here. Here's a plot of the flux of carbon, which is this part. And then we can see our descriptors show a slight trend when I look at overall patterns. But there's kind of, when I look at just those indices plotted that way, it's not so clear. What if I plot density and richness in a spatial temporal model where this is the distance from the head of the fjord to the mouth, and this is the year, what we see are some really different patterns over time. And so we see that density and richness are higher in this section, which is, density is higher and richness lower here, which is toward the head of the fjord. So this has less carbon, less glacial influences, and therefore more carbon. The glacial flower dilutes carbon, right? So we have higher diversity here, higher richness, number of species, which is kind of curious, but it's associated with the stress at the head of the fjord. So that we have a stressed environment with smaller animals, more numerous, and there's more kinds there. They're actually, so this is, if you note these numbers, we're talking about individuals per meter squared of, 200, 300. That's a stress resulting from glacial sediments and low carbon deposition in our basin. So important point is, we see a natural gradient. We see a result of natural gradient. We're able to use our long-term database to tease out that role. And here's the pictures of animals from 1971. We can see that there, actually this is 2002, excuse me. We can see that there are some animals that don't like the head of the fjord. Some animals that have higher abundance towards the head of the fjord where there's higher glacial sediments. So these guys are more stress tolerant, and these guys are less, especially that guy, are less stress tolerant. This guy just kind of occurs throughout everywhere, but it does have higher densities away from this area. So that sediment gradient is persistent and continues through the fjord that I was looking at climate variability. This comes back to that plot that I showed earlier about benthic communities and their relationship with the Arctic Oscillation. We see the same thing in Port Valdez. Notice that there's a very poor relationship out here. We expect that was an effect of recovery from the large earthquake, actually, so that over time these systems were not in balance. But a balanced community, for what we're looking at, appears to be one that is closely associated with climate factors, when we believe that the climate factors are driving changes in water circulation, and so that our communities should be in balance with patterns of water circulation. Higher water circulation bringing more food, more larvae, more kinds of animals, lower water circulation, slower water circulation, and this system not bringing as much food or not transporting as many larvae into the system. So we see effects on both abundance and the number of taxa. So here's that plot again from the Chukchi Sea, similar pattern, suggesting that our communities, when they're in balance, are not actually at a stable equilibrium point, but that we have factors that they're resulting with and that they're in some sort of natural relationship with, and that represents our balance for these communities. So, earthquake. We had a lot of large earthquakes recently, and we had one in 1964. The fjord itself was not too influenced by the earthquake itself. It was on the axis of change, so there's like maybe an inch of change, whereas a centimeter or two of change. Whereas out in the glacier in Prince William Sound, there was up to 20 meters of uplift on some places. So, but what happened here was that the soft sediments in this area slumped and then flowed out this way, causing just covering up the communities there. The subsurface slide was really big, and then tsunamis came in and essentially scoured the sides of the fjord up to like 40 feet. So, it's 30 meters. No, that would be 120 feet. About 15 meters on your side. And so when I started working there in 1986, the boat captain or the boat operator would say, "Yep, see there's the line where it just got scoured clean." So we had some really large effects. Essentially, it reset not only this community but others in Prince William Sound, and it had actually I have magnitude 9.1, so I should say 9.2. It really affected all of the communities in the area. The marine communities. So in Port Valdez, most of the communities were influenced by sediment slumping and tsunamis, not directly by the earthquake itself in terms of uplifting. Not a lot of change there. So here we're going to look at some of these other sites out here. What I wanted to show is that we started sampling in 1971, so we're significantly after the earthquake. And we still saw this community gaining balance. So we have this little worm. It's not a very big worm, by the way. It's you wouldn't even first think it, you would not realize that this thing could have any ecological significance. It's like a sewing thread kind of thing. And but in 71 there were none of them here. 76 there were a few. 82 we found a few more, and then 2002 there were quite numerous, some of them up to 6,000 individuals in this area. So these are repeatedly sampled sites, and we're using, even though taxonomists have changed, the lab was essentially the same, so we all knew what we were looking at. And so that's a pretty remarkable change over time. And one of our conclusions is that maybe it took up to 26 years for the system to really gain balance back from the earthquake. And it was one of the least affected areas in the site, and least affected sites in the area. So some of the other areas that we would think are we would look at and say pristine or equilibrium, are changing still in Prince William Sound. They're still just alone from the earthquake. So here's a comparison of some other species between 71 and 2002, and you can see how the communities have changed for these dominant species. These are all polychaetes. So their numbers have increased and their distributions have changed, have increased over time. So here's another spatial temporal plots, and you can see that this is a major, we think a major influence, that this point of break here represents when these communities moved into balance. So I think that's duplicate size. We just talked about that. Okay. So Solomon Gulch Fish Hatchery. The fish hatchery is here. The marine oil terminal is there. One would think that it could have an effect that the terminal activities here could have an effect over there. But it really doesn't seem to do that. These guys have begun to produce large numbers of salmon. They're different kinds. The returns are now in the millions. And this has become one of the greatest sport fisheries in the interior in Alaska because people have access. They can go put their boats in the water and they can go catch this excess. And the excess has been really good. So it's just become a fantastic local and Alaskan fishery resource. So what we're looking at here is the biomass of benthic animals in grams per meter squared versus the salmon returns. And we do have something of an increasing trend. That we're looking at these sites are from the deep basin. So you know what it's suggesting is that there is some carbon from these salmon returning back, being pumped back down into the deep basin. So this does not account near shore, near the system, and near the hatchery we have the classic excess of organic carbon and associated effects from that. But what we're looking at is the returns of carcasses. So in some years the carcasses are so excessive they pile up like big piles on the beach and it just smells horrible. Right, so they have very large excess returns, and near shore we would expect that to even have larger effects. So we would consider this a very weak but yet significant contributor to the ecology of the area. Valdez Marine Oil Terminal. This is another shot of one of the berths. They use these little things there to offload the oil. They have a study area here. Here's our terminal. We have a series of sites. There is a diffuser pipeline that discharges treated waters about 60 to 80 meters deep. Our net flow of water is around this way. And so that's a study. This is what I actually did is I drew a straight line across here. And because there was very little three-dimensional depth this way, most of these are along the same depth contour, about 40 meters. We attempted there. So I can look at changes in time in hydrocarbon concentrations. That's the sum of 18 priority hydrocarbons identified by EPA. And for those who might know about that, it does not include any alkyl homologs, just the parent hydrocarbons. And so we can see higher hydrocarbons here with declining values. This is a point where we introduced biological treatment into the system, and as a result of that, you can see that the hydrocarbons have declined tremendously. And this also coincides about here with the advent of the double-hulled tankers. So that has contributed from about this point on into the declines as well. We knew that there had to be some effects somewhere. You just can't dump stuff out into the ocean and not see some effects. But it wasn't until we could get this long-term record and see some changes here that we began to see that a couple species, actually tube-dwelling polychaetes, were actually sensitive, and it's providing some evidence of what kind of animals might be responding to chemical contamination in sediments. And we can begin to see that these animals are coming back where the hydrocarbons are low. And so for Alaska, that's pretty important because there's no evidence or no understanding of how these cold water communities might respond to chemical pollutants. So, and it is just the percent abundance that we're looking at here of 2 tube-dwelling polychaetes increasing where hydrocarbon concentrations are lower. Just for reference, from the Alaska Monitoring Assessment Program, they determined hydrocarbon concentrations in throughout south central Alaska. They're pretty high. Average for our Valdez Marine Oil Terminal from 89 to 2007 was about here. It's a little bit lower, but in their deep basin, it's significantly lower, and these are approaching background concentrations. These high values are, curiously enough, driven by high hydrocarbon concentrations in local little harbors. They're utilized by fishermen. So that's like the fishing communities at Cordova, Port Valdez. Everybody has their little, local harbor. And what they did is they ended up trapping the contaminants because there was poor circulation through these harbors, and so the hydrocarbon concentrations accumulate. So other studies in Port Valdez, we've got a lot. This is just what I presented is just a summary, and we've actually gained enough to really begin to understand the system and begin to gain some insights into ecological processes over space and time in Alaskan fjords. And this is just a summary of some of the other kind of things that we've looked at there. I think what we've learned, some of the key ideas of what we've learned, that are kind of the take-home messages from this very quick fly through our data. Biological responses to and recovery from stress are mediated by local characteristics. And one of the aspects of for instance, that struck me with the intertidal component when we're looking at Dr. Schubert's presentation was that exposure to low salinity is sporadic and seasonal and inconsistent. Yet it's the exposure is strong enough to actually seem to be associated with some biological effects. But the local responses are definitely site-specific. Earthquake had long-lasting effects. When people started working there in 1971, they were assuming that they were looking at background reference conditions, and people started investigations on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. They were also assuming that they were in background or equilibrium states. Our data from this study now, it's, the Exxon Valdez oil spill was 89. We started an annual study, adjusted our study so we can actually begin to see things about in 89. So we didn't have this information then. It looks like the system took 26 years to recover, and that was much longer, I think, than anybody expected. And so we just have to be aware when we start working in systems that our ideas, a concept of equilibrium, has to be a little bit different in the marine environment than it is in a terrestrial system. And one of the important things that doesn't maybe come as clearly through this presentation as I would have liked is that interactions between sources of stress can have unanticipated effects. And if we're going to manage or we're going to think about long-term changes, we're going to think about predicting changes, we're going to think about what might happen when we do something, we really need to take a look at indirect effects and multiple stressors and think through potentials for those, because those can have much larger effects than we would anticipate. And I believe that is the end of the presentation. For questions? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
To be an enclosed area, whether it can be applied to the open ocean, and if yes, how does the subsisting or existing water currents operating within the open ocean, how are they expected to respond to such a treatment and its likely maybe effect in other places depending on the
Okay. So the question you're asking is if ballast waters are discharged into the open ocean, will they have this? What kind of effects would they have, and what would the patterns be? Yeah.
Whether the treatment in itself, since the treatment for the area you presented appeared to be for an enclosed area. So, and I do know ballast water discharged by ships,
Right.
especially like personally in my own research area, it's a very, very significant problem, but it's like an open ocean, not an enclosed area.
Right.
Where the same treatment applies to the open ocean that is not controlled or that does not appear closed, and if so, maybe possibilities of multiplier effect of such. Thank you.
Yeah. So effects like this are obviously easier to see, and in an enclosed situation becomes essentially a miniature experiment, right? I think that if we put this out in the open ocean, well, actually, if you put this discharge out into an area with high circulation, the contaminants would be quickly diluted, and you would not necessarily see them accumulate in the sediments like we have the problem here. But I think in that case it would depend on what other kind of contaminants are in the system and how fast something is diluted. One of our problems is that we perceive of an individual pollutant as being, okay, this is just a small addition to the ocean. But if you are in California, that could be a significant addition to the contamination load. So you would have to take in other factors like that. If in Alaska, if this was just put out into an area with a high current and it was exposed and there was no potential for accumulation, you might not see much effect. And in fact, in terms of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, in areas where the current was high enough and it could remove the contaminants leaking out, you don't see a lot. So that current speed and the ability of the contaminants to be diluted as an individual contaminant makes a big difference. I think that one of the things that we're beginning to see, though, is that it's not just the individual contaminant, it's the rest of the contaminants that are also being released in the water column. Is there a sewage treatment plant nearby? Is there industrial components? And when you begin to add those together, they can begin to reach critical conditions that might therefore result in changes, similar changes on larger scales. South California Bight, for instance, is a place where, and estuaries, although larger scale estuaries. But in the open ocean, I think that the effects are going to occur potentially in the water column, in production, in zooplankton as well. And some of them actually can accumulate the hydrocarbons, and then they can become phototoxic. And there's some work with that. And so there's another pathway for them to if the concentrations get too high. In the open ocean, though, for the most part, with an individual pollutant, they can get diluted. So as long as they can get diluted quick enough, there should, for most of what the kind of stuff we're looking at, it shouldn't be a problem. But the garbage patch in the North Pacific suggests that, you know what, we can't consider each one of these individually alone. And it doesn't, it doesn't eliminate the possibility that 20 miles down the coastline, that there might be a point where those contaminants from a variety of sources might not accumulate in sediments at a distance because they might enter the current might enter an estuary. So, you know, but that again comes down to the accumulation of multiple stressors rather than an individual stressor. So I think, okay, got questions out here.
Thank you for this really nice presentation. It was striking to me that you had a 26 years delay in your data, but it seemed that all species you were monitoring were increasing in this time. This 26 years delay after the earthquake to reinstall the system as it was probably before. So there might be no competition between them. It really took 26 years to reinstall. But any idea what was hampering their success?
So a couple things is that in this situation, all of the seed populations that would populate Port Valdez, either they're downstream or upstream from them. You know, everything, you got downstream and upstream, right? Everything flowing through, all of those components were affected and reduced. So I think we have, one, that we had the seed populations across the board in Prince William Sound were damaged. Second is the glacial fjord, and it has a sill at about 150 meters. And so we believe that that also inhibited recovery. But the other component is that there was also other potentially the geological component in that sediment stability, the sediment structure all changed, and so glacial patterns. And you know, I can't discount that glaciers are suddenly disappearing in Port Valdez. Well, the shaking was that bad in Prince William Sound. How did that impact these glaciers that were not as big in Port Valdez, in the watershed, in the Valdez watershed? You know, if it cracked them and they eroded faster, you would have a tremendous change in the rates of all of that right from the start, and then it would be slowing down. And part of that problem might be associated with the fish hatchery providing extra carbon to the system, that they might there might be some interaction there. What we did see from when we went there in 1971, we saw lots of deposit-feeding brittle stars, and we don't see those anymore. And so we know that the system has changed, and we can follow those numbers through, not, as I showed, not just overall, but with individual species. And we just think that because the system is throughout the Prince William Sound is highly stratified in the water column, and there's sills, multiple sills, and the system, it just took that long for animals to move and to migrate in and to resettle and distribute. Water circulation in the deep basin of the fjord where that data came from was deep, and circulation is not fast. So other than that, we don't know. It's a really cool problem.
Considering this is a deep water port, have you looked at the impact the correction has on deposition, like new migration of heavy light particles?
We have not looked at the impact of the migration of metals. Sadi Naidu from our department, a geologist, did some early work in the fjord and looked at some of that information. We have, I guess, the state of Alaska for some of those kind of questions, or that we're even still determining mass accumulation rates for some of our areas. There actually has been some dredging and stuff going on, and we can see some biological effects. And admittedly, that is an area of poor knowledge. I would direct you, for more interest, into the two authors, Sadi Naidu and John Truffrey. John Truffrey's been working up in the Arctic some, and they actually did some really interesting work about some heavy metals recently in the Chukchi Sea, and accumulations on some unexpected top predatory bivalve or gastropods, and so that unfortunately is an area that's not got a lot of work on it in the area. So, yes.
I have a quick question for you. I promise to make it quick because we need to leave for lunch.
Yeah.
What you're dealing with in this sound is a spatial gradient from east to west, right? And
Right.
You're saying that east is, I think, high disturbance and west is low disturbance. And it's a little bit late in the piece to be recommending this because you have so much data already. But the thing is that if you're sampling across this gradient, looking for changes, and one area has high dynamics and the other area has low dynamics, you'll pick up changes, but you won't pick them up as readily as if you broke them. Actually, you could probably still do it. Broke them into sections and said, okay, we'll have a western section, a middle section, and an eastern section, and you may be, your analyses may be more sensitive to picking up changes. It's just something that occurred to me.
Actually, that's a very good point, and I wish I could convince the people working in the Chukchi Sea of that point, because they're allocating a lot of resources to sampling in areas with the highest variability because they're the most interesting, and they're calling those long-term monitoring sites. And that's a very good point, and I agree with you completely. One of the things, the cool things is that in this particular study, we're deep enough and this fjord is protected enough that we're actually capturing the gradient effects. And for the purposes of what the study's funded for, the study design has actually met the criteria for determining effects related to the hydrocarbon, because they're one kind of constant band. But that is a really good point. It should always be kept in mind when designing studies, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think that one of the other components that extends to is also making sure to measure the appropriate temporal covariates, because they'll do the same exact thing over time. And this is a major consideration in an environmental studies program. Point well taken. Thank you. So,
if there are no further questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.